Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might just lull you into the deepest sleep you've had in months. The surprisingly mundane yet utterly fascinating world of medieval sailors and their daily battle against the endless, churning seas. While Hollywood shows us dramatic shipwrecks and heroic last stands, the reality was far more tedious, far more methodical, and honestly, far more boring. Which is exactly what we're going for tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's the year 1347, and you're standing on the deck of a merchant vessel somewhere in the North Sea. The horizon stretches endlessly in every direction, a grey line where water meets sky. There's no GPS, no weather radar, no coast guard to call for help. Just you, 30 other sailors, and a wooden ship that creaks ominously with every wave. The wind is picking up, and those clouds on the horizon don't look friendly. In a few hours, you'll be fighting for your life against forces that have claimed thousands of ships before yours. But here's the thing about medieval sailors and storms. They didn't survive through luck or divine intervention. They survived through mind-numbingly repetitive preparation, obsessive attention to detail, and procedures so boring they could cure insomnia. You see, when most people think of medieval storms at sea, they imagine dramatic moments. Lightning splitting the sky, waves the size of castles, sailors screaming prayers into the howling wind. And yes, those moments happened. But they weren't what kept ships afloat. What kept ships afloat were the thousands of small, tedious tasks performed day after day after day. The careful inspection of every rope, the methodical checking of every barrel, the systematic arrangement of cargo that seemed pointless until the moment it saved everyone's lives. Medieval sailors developed their storm survival techniques, not through grand theories or brilliant innovations, but through generations of trial and error. Mostly error. Ships that tried new approaches often disappeared without a trace, taking their lessons with them to the bottom of the sea. The ships that survived were the ones that stuck to proven, boring methods. Methods that had been tested by countless storms and countless sailors who lived to tell extremely dull tales about rope maintenance and barrel placement. And tonight, we're going to explore every single one of these magnificently mundane survival techniques. From the proper way to secure a chicken coop in rough seas, to the exact angle at which sails should be trimmed when the wind reaches a certain speed. From the specific prayers that sailors believed worked better than others, to the precise method of tying knots that might hold when everything else falls apart. It's going to be wonderfully, gloriously boring. The kind of detailed, methodical content that will have you drifting off before you know it. But first, let's talk about the ships themselves. Because understanding how medieval vessels were built is crucial to understanding how they survived storms. And trust me, the construction techniques were about as exciting as watching paint dry on a particularly humid day. Medieval ships weren't built for speed or comfort. They were built like floating coffins, with delusions of grandeur. The average merchant vessel, or cog as they were often called, was essentially a large wooden bathtub with a sail attached. These ships were wide, deep and stable. Not because medieval shipbuilders were trying to create seaworthy vessels, but because they needed to carry as much cargo as possible while still having some hope of not sinking immediately upon leaving port. The hull construction process was mind-numbingly methodical. First, shipwrights would select oak timbers, each one inspected for grain patterns, knots, and signs of rot. The inspection process alone could take weeks. Each timber had to be seasoned for years before use. Not months, years. The shipbuilders would stack the wood in carefully arranged piles, rotating each piece according to a schedule that made medieval monastery routines look spontaneous. Once the timbers were deemed ready, the actual construction began with the laying of the keel. The keel was the ship's backbone, and its placement required astronomical calculations to ensure it aligned properly with celestial bodies. Medieval shipwrights believed, quite seriously, that a ship's keel had to be laid when certain stars were in specific positions. This meant construction could be delayed for months, waiting for the right celestial alignment. Imagine explaining that to a modern project manager. The planking process was equally tedious. Each plank had to be shaped by hand using tools that hadn't changed in centuries. Adzes, draw knives and planes were used to shape every single piece of wood. The planks were then fitted together using a technique called clinker building, where each plank overlapped the one below it. Every overlap had to be perfect. Too much gap and the ship would leak. Too little gap and the wood couldn't expand and contract with moisture changes. Between each plank, shipwrights stuffed oakum, which was essentially old rope that had been picked apart fibre by fibre. This job was usually given to prisoners or the poorest workers, who would sit for hours methodically unravelling old ropes thread by thread. The oakum was then mixed with tar to create a waterproof seal. The amount of oakum required for a single ship was staggering. Miles and miles of old rope, picked apart by hand, one fibre at a time. The tar itself was another exercise in medieval patience. Pine tar was produced by burning pine wood in specially constructed kilns. The process took days of continuous monitoring. Workers had to maintain exact temperatures, adjust airflow, and collect the tar at precisely the right consistency. Too thin, and it wouldn't seal properly. Too thick, and it wouldn't spread evenly. The margin for error was tiny, and getting it wrong meant starting over. Once the hull was complete, it had to be waterproofed. This involved coating the entire exterior with multiple layers of tar, tallow, and sometimes lead sheets. Each layer had to dry completely before the next was applied. In damp climates, this could take weeks per layer. Workers would stand for hours, carefully brushing tar onto wood, making sure every square inch was covered evenly. The rigging was its own special form of medieval torture. Every rope had to be made by hand from hemp fibres. The process began with harvesting hemp, which then had to be retted, a process that involves soaking the plants in water for weeks until the fibres separated. The retted hemp was then beaten with wooden tools to break down the plant matter, leaving only the fibres. These fibres were then combed, twisted into strands, and finally woven into rope. A single merchant ship required miles of rope in various thicknesses. The thickest cables, used for anchoring and major structural support, were as thick as a man's arm and required teams of rope makers working in coordination. The process was so labour-intensive that rope making became a specialised trade with its own guilds, apprenticeships, and jealously guarded secrets. But the rope making was only the beginning. Once installed on the ship, every piece of rigging had to be checked daily. Medieval sailors developed an almost obsessive relationship with their ropes. They could tell by touch if a rope was beginning to fray. They knew by sound if the tension was correct. They had specific procedures for inspecting every inch of rigging. Procedures that took hours to complete properly. The sails themselves were woven from linen or hemp cloth, and creating enough sailcloth for a single ship was a massive undertaking. Medieval weavers worked on looms that produced cloth only a few feet wide, so large sails had to be sewn together from multiple strips. Each seam had to be perfectly straight and incredibly strong. The thread used for sewing sails was specially treated with tar and wax to make it waterproof and rot resistant. And then there was the sail maintenance. Sails couldn't just be hung up and forgotten. They required constant care. In dry weather they had to be dampened to prevent cracking. In wet weather they had to be dried to prevent rot. They had to be checked regularly for tiny holes that could tear into massive rips during storms. Sailors spent countless hours darning sails, using techniques that were more like embroidery than simple sewing. The anchors deserved their own category of medieval engineering tedium. Early anchors were simply large stones with holes drilled through them for rope attachment. But by the medieval period, anchors had evolved into complex iron constructions that required specialised blacksmiths to forge. Each anchor was custom-made for its specific ship, and the forging process could take weeks. The anchor chain was another marvel of medieval patience. Each link had to be forged individually, heated, shaped, welded, and tested. A single anchor chain contained hundreds of links, and each one had to be perfect. A weak link meant a lost anchor, and a lost anchor often meant a lost ship. Even the ship's compass, when they finally started using them in the later medieval period, was a study in methodical preparation. The compass needle had to be magnetised using lodestone, a process that involves stroking the needle hundreds of times in exactly the same direction. The compass housing had to be perfectly balanced and sealed against moisture. The compass card, marked with directions, had to be painted with precise accuracy using techniques that hadn't changed since ancient times. Food storage on medieval ships was perhaps the most boring topic imaginable and absolutely critical to survival. Every piece of food had to be preserved using techniques that were labour-intensive beyond belief. Meat was salted using specific ratios of salt to meat, then hung in controlled conditions for weeks or months. The salt had to be the right type, applied evenly, and the drying conditions had to be perfect. Hardtack, the sailors' staple food, was made from flour and water, mixed to exact proportions, rolled to precise thickness, and baked until it achieved the consistency of edible concrete. The baking process alone took days, and each batch had to be tested to ensure it would last months at sea without spoiling. Water storage was even more critical and equally tedious. Wooden barrels had to be seasoned with wine or vinegar to prevent the wood from contaminating the water. Each barrel was tested for leaks by filling it completely and checking for seepage over several days. The hoops holding the barrels together had to be adjusted regularly as the wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The process of preparing a medieval ship for a long voyage was like watching grass grow, except grass grows faster and is considerably more exciting. Every single item that went aboard had to be catalogued, weighed and positioned according to principles that made medieval accounting look thrilling by comparison. The ship's manifest wasn't just a list, it was a mathematical treatise on the precise distribution of weight that could mean the difference between riding out a storm and becoming fish food. Cargo placement followed rules so specific they bordered on the mystical. Heavy items like iron tools and weapons went in the very bottom of the hold, not randomly scattered about, but arranged in patterns that balanced the ship's centre of gravity. Each barrel, each crate, each bundle of goods had to be positioned according to charts that medieval merchants guarded more carefully than their gold. The process of loading a ship could take weeks, with every item being moved, measured, and repositioned until the balance was absolutely perfect. The ship's ballast was particularly fascinating in its mind-numbing precision. Ballast wasn't just rocks thrown into the bottom of the ship. It was carefully selected stone, often quarried from specific locations, known for producing rocks of consistent weight and density. Each piece of ballast was weighed individually and placed according to diagrams that looked like medieval architectural plans. Too much ballast and the ship rode too low in the water. Too little and it became unstable in rough seas. Getting it exactly right required mathematical calculations that would challenge modern engineers. Medieval sailors developed an almost supernatural ability to feel their ship's balance. Experienced sailors could tell if cargo had shifted just by the way the deck felt under their feet. They knew the exact angle at which their ship should list in different wind conditions. They could predict how the ship would behave in various sea states based on how it responded to small waves in calm weather. This knowledge wasn't learned from books or schools. It was absorbed through years of mind-numbing observation and repetition. The daily routine aboard a medieval ship was structured with military precision, not because sailors were particularly disciplined, but because routine was the only thing standing between them and chaos. Every day began before dawn with the same series of tasks performed in exactly the same order. The night watch would wake the day watch using a system of bells that hadn't changed in generations. Each bell pattern meant something specific, and sailors learned to interpret these signals even in their sleep. The first task of each day was checking the bilge. The bilge was the lowest part of the ship, where water naturally collected, and it had to be pumped dry every single morning without fail. The bilge pump was a simple device, essentially a large tube with a plunger, but operating it required coordination between multiple crew members. One man would operate the handle, while others positioned buckets and made sure the water was directed overboard rather than back into the ship. Bilge water wasn't just water. It was a foul mixture of seawater, leaked drinking water, food scraps, and various bodily fluids that had found their way below decks. The smell was indescribable, and the task of pumping it out was universally despised, but it had to be done every single day, regardless of weather, illness, or personal preference. Ships that neglected bilge pumping didn't last long. After the bilge came the daily inspection of the hull. This involved crew members crawling into the lowest parts of the ship with lanterns, examining every plank, every joint, every piece of oakum for signs of leakage. The inspection followed a specific route that ensured every square inch of the hull interior was checked. Any sign of water intrusion, no matter how small, was immediately reported and repaired. Hull repairs at sea were exercises in creative problem solving using the most basic tools imaginable. Small leaks were plugged with oakum hammered into the gaps using mallets and chisels. Larger problems required more drastic measures. Sometimes crew members had to go over the side of the ship in rough seas to patch holes from the outside, a job that was both terrifying and boring in equal measure. The sail inspection was equally methodical. Every morning, crew members would examine every inch of every sail for signs of wear, tears, or weakness. They used a specific pattern of inspection, starting at the bottom left corner of each sail and working systematically across and up. Any problem, no matter how minor, was noted and scheduled for repair. Sails weren't just checked visually. Experienced sailors would run their hands along the fabric, feeling for thin spots or areas where the weave was beginning to separate. Sail repair was an art form that combined needlework, engineering, and prayer. Small holes were patched using pieces of similar cloth sewn on, with stitches so tight they were practically waterproof. Larger tiers required more complex repairs that could take days to complete properly. The thread used for sail repair was prepared specially, soaked in tar and beeswax to make it both waterproof and flexible. The rope inspection was perhaps the most tedious task of all. Every single piece of rigging had to be examined daily for signs of fraying, stretching, or weakness. Sailors developed an almost intimate relationship with their ropes. They knew which pieces of rigging were newer, which were reaching the end of their useful life, and which could be trusted in extreme conditions. Rope that showed any sign of weakness was immediately replaced, not repaired. There was no such thing as a temporary fix when it came to rigging. Replacing rigging at sea was a job that required multiple crew members working in perfect coordination. The old rope had to be removed without compromising the ship's stability, and the new rope had to be installed and tensioned to exactly the right specification. This often had to be done while the ship was moving through rough seas, with crew members climbing high into the rigging while the ship pitched and rolled beneath them. The ship's compass, when one was available, required daily attention that bordered on religious devotion. The compass housing had to be checked for moisture intrusion, the needle had to be tested for proper magnetization, and the compass card had to be inspected for damage. Medieval sailors treated their compass like a sacred object, because in many ways it was. Without it, navigation became a matter of guesswork and prayer. Navigation itself was a combination of science, art, and pure stubbornness. Medieval navigators used techniques that had been passed down through generations, techniques that worked not because they were scientifically perfect, but because they had been tested by thousands of voyages. Dead reckoning was the primary method, which involved calculating position based on speed, time, and direction travelled from a known starting point. Measuring speed at sea was accomplished using a device called a log line, which was exactly as exciting as it sounds. The log line was a rope with knots tied at regular intervals, attached to a piece of wood that was thrown overboard. As the ship moved forward, the rope would pay out, and sailors would count how many knots passed through their hands in a specific amount of time. This gave them a rough estimate of their speed, which they could then use to calculate distance travelled. The time measurement was done using sand glasses, which had to be turned regularly by crew members assigned specifically to that task. Keeping accurate time at sea was crucial for navigation, but it was also mind-numbingly boring. Someone had to watch the sand glass constantly and flip it the moment the sand ran out. Missing a turn meant the time calculation would be wrong, which could throw off navigation calculations for the entire voyage. Direction was determined using the sun, stars, and compass when available. Medieval navigators had extensive knowledge of celestial navigation, but it wasn't the romantic stargazing you might imagine. It involved tedious mathematical calculations performed with crude instruments under difficult conditions. Taking a sun sight required precise timing and careful measurement, often while standing on a moving deck in rough seas. Weather prediction was based entirely on observation and experience. Medieval sailors developed an encyclopedic knowledge of cloud formations, wind patterns, and atmospheric conditions. They could predict weather changes hours or even days in advance, not through meteorological science, but through pattern recognition developed over years of careful observation. The signs they watched for were subtle and numerous: the colour of the sky at sunrise and sunset, the behaviour of seabirds, the smell of the air, the feel of the wind on their skin. Experienced sailors could detect changes in barometric pressure through physical sensations, headaches, joint pain, or changes in the way sounds carried across the water. When storms were predicted, the preparation process began immediately and followed procedures that had been refined over generations. Every single item on deck had to be secured or moved below. This wasn't just a matter of tying things down. It involved systematically working through the entire ship, checking every rope, every barrel, every piece of equipment to ensure it couldn't break loose and become a projectile in heavy seas. The galley where food was prepared had to be completely secured for storms. Cooking fires were extinguished and the firebox filled with sand. All cooking implements were stowed in specially designed racks that prevented them from moving even in the worst conditions. Food preparation during storms was limited to items that could be eaten cold, because lighting a fire in rough seas was not just impractical, it was potentially catastrophic. Personal belongings were secured using techniques that medieval sailors had perfected through bitter experience. Everything had to be tied down, wedged in place, or stowed in containers that couldn't open accidentally. Sailors learned to live with the absolute minimum of personal possessions, because anything that couldn't be completely secured would be lost overboard or become dangerous debris during storms. The process of preparing for a storm could take an entire day, with every crew member assigned specific tasks that had to be completed in a particular order. There were checklists, though not written ones, that existed in the collective memory of the crew. Missing any step in the preparation could mean disaster when the storm actually hit. The storm preparation wasn't complete until every crew member had mentally rehearsed their specific role in the upcoming ordeal. Medieval sailors didn't have emergency drills in the modern sense, but they had something far more tedious: endless, verbal repetition of procedures that had to be followed when the weather turned violent. Each sailor knew exactly where to position himself when the captain gave specific orders. They knew which ropes to grab, which direction to move, and how to avoid getting in each other's way on a deck that would soon be slick with spray and tilting at impossible angles. These procedures were practiced through constant verbal rehearsal during calm weather, with experienced sailors quizzing newer crew members on proper storm responses until they could recite the procedures in their sleep. The ship's livestock presented their own special category of storm preparation tedium. Medieval ships often carried chickens, pigs, and sometimes goats for fresh food during long voyages. Each animal had to be secured in specially constructed pens that could withstand the violent motion of a ship in heavy seas. The pens weren't just cages, they were engineering marvels designed to keep animals safe, while preventing them from becoming dangerous projectiles. Chicken coops had to be reinforced with extra rope and positioned in the most stable part of the ship. The chickens themselves had to be checked to ensure they were healthy enough to survive the stress of a storm. Sick or weak birds were often slaughtered before storms hit, not out of cruelty, but because dead chickens floating around in a storm were both unsanitary and dangerous. Pigs required even more elaborate preparation. Pig pens had to be designed to drain properly, because seasick pigs create conditions that are both disgusting and hazardous. The pens needed to be strong enough to contain animals that might panic during rough weather, but also positioned so that if something did go wrong, the pigs wouldn't endanger the crew. Water and feed for the animals had to be secured separately from human supplies. Animal feed was stored in specially designed containers that could be accessed even in rough seas, because hungry animals were often more dangerous than the storm itself. The containers had to be waterproof, rodent-proof, and positioned so they wouldn't shift during violent ship movements. The ship's rats, which were inevitable passengers on every medieval vessel, actually served as early warning systems for experienced sailors. Rats could sense changes in barometric pressure and would often become agitated hours before storms hit. Sailors learned to watch rat behaviour as carefully as they watched the sky. When rats started moving to higher parts of the ship or becoming unusually active, it was often the first sign that weather was changing. Personal storm preparation among the crew followed rituals that were part practical necessity and part superstition. Each sailor had a specific set of clothing designated for storm duty. This wasn't just their warmest or most waterproof gear, though it was that too. Storm clothing had to be designed to stay on in high winds while allowing enough freedom of movement to work with ropes and rigging. The process of consuming. Each piece of clothing had to be secured, ickle, and timed with multiple ties. On storm gear was methysteenings. Loose clothing could catch and foil the wind and pull a sailor overboard, or get tangled in rigging at something as simple as a hat required special storm preparation, with crucial moments, Evan ties to keep it attached to its owner. Medieval multiple strings, and sailors developed an almost ritualistic approach to storm preparation that helped them maintain psychological calm in the face of terrifying natural forces. They would methodically check and double-check every knot, every rope, every piece of equipment, not because they didn't trust their initial work, but because the repetitive process helped control the fear that every sailor felt when facing a serious storm. The ship's water supply received special attention before storms. Fresh water was the most precious cargo on any medieval vessel, and losing it during a storm meant certain death, even if the ship survived. Water barrels had to be checked for secure positioning and proper sealing. The hoops holding the barrels together were tightened and checked for any sign of weakness. Backup water supplies were prepared and positioned in different parts of the ship. Medieval sailors learned through bitter experience that putting all their water in one location was asking for trouble. If that part of the ship was damaged during a storm, the entire crew could die of thirst even if they successfully rode out the weather. The process of securing water barrels was incredibly tedious, but absolutely critical. Each barrel had to be wedged in place, with wooden blocks cut to exact specifications. The blocks had to be positioned so they would hold the barrels steady even if the ship rolled completely on its side. The wedges themselves had to be secured with ropes to prevent them from working loose and becoming dangerous debris. Food preparation before storms involved creating meals that could sustain the crew for days without any cooking. Hardtack was supplemented with dried meat, cheese, and anything else that wouldn't spoil quickly. The food had to be portioned out and stored in containers that could be accessed even in the worst conditions. Hungry sailors were dangerous sailors, and maintaining nutrition during storms was crucial for crew survival. The ship's tools and weapons required their own storm preparation procedures. Every axe, knifey, hammer and sword had to be secured in specially designed racks. Loose tools in a storm weren't just lost equipment, they were deadly weapons that could kill crew members or damage vital ship systems. The tool racks were designed with multiple locking mechanisms that required deliberate action to open, preventing accidental releases during violent ship movements. Weapons received particular attention because they were often needed immediately after storms passed. Pirates and hostile vessels sometimes attacked ships that had been weakened by bad weather. Swords and crossbows had to be stored where they could be accessed quickly, but secured well enough that they wouldn't be damaged or lost during the storm itself. The ship's anchor system underwent extensive preparation before any predicted storm. The anchor wasn't just dropped and forgotten. The anchor cable had to be inspected link by link for any sign of weakness. Weak links were replaced immediately, because anchor failure during a storm often meant the ship would be driven onto rocks or into shallow water where it would break apart. The anchor windlass, the mechanical device used to raise and lower the anchor, received careful maintenance and testing. Every gear, every rope, every mechanical component had to function perfectly when the crew's lives depended on it. The windlass was lubricated with special grease that wouldn't wash away in heavy seas, and backup systems were prepared in case the primary windlass failed. Multiple anchors were often deployed during serious storms, each one positioned at specific angles to hold the ship steady against changing wind directions. The mathematical calculations required to position multiple anchors correctly were complex enough that they were usually handled by the most experienced crew members. Getting the angles wrong could result in anchors fouling each other or failing to hold the ship properly. The ship's hull received a final inspection before storms, with crew members checking every seam, every joint, every piece of caulking for signs of potential failure. Small problems that might be ignored in calm weather became critical concerns when the ship would be subjected to massive stresses from wind and waves. Even tiny leaks could become catastrophic failures when the ship was being pounded by storm seas. Caulking repairs were made using techniques that had been perfected over generations. Old caulking was scraped out completely and replaced with fresh oakum and tar. The work had to be done quickly but thoroughly, because partially completed caulking repairs were often worse than no repairs at all. Wet oakum could swell and actually enlarge gaps between planks instead of sealing them. The psychological preparation for storms was as important as the physical preparation, though it was rarely discussed openly. Medieval sailors developed personal rituals that helped them cope with the terror of facing natural forces that could destroy their ship in minutes. Some sailors had lucky charms or religious medallions that they would touch or hold during storms. Others had specific prayers or songs that they would recite silently. The crew's morale during storm preparation was carefully managed by experienced captains and officers. Fear was contagious aboard ships, and panic could be more dangerous than the storm itself. Officers would maintain calm, methodical approaches to storm preparation, demonstrating through their behaviour that the situation was serious but manageable. Crew members took their emotional cues from their leaders, so maintaining the appearance of confident competence was crucial. Sleep before storms was systematically managed to ensure that crew members would be as rested as possible when the real work began. Storm duty could last for days without breaks, so getting proper rest beforehand was a matter of survival. The crew was divided into watches that allowed some men to sleep, while others maintained the ship's preparation activities. The sleeping arrangements during storm preparation were designed for maximum rest in minimum time. Hammocks were preferred over fixed bunks because they moved with the ship's motion rather than fighting against it. Each sailor knew exactly how to position his hammock for the most comfortable sleep possible, given the ship's movement and the noise of ongoing preparation activities. Even the ship's cats, which were kept aboard to control rats, required storm preparation. Cats had to be secured in containers or cages to prevent them from being injured or lost overboard during rough weather. The containers had to provide adequate ventilation and space while being strong enough to protect the cats from the violent motion of the ship. The preparation process created a rhythm aboard the ship that helped crew members maintain focus despite their fear. Each task led naturally to the next, and the steady progression of completed preparations provided psychological reassurance that they were doing everything possible to survive the coming ordeal. The boring, methodical nature of storm preparation was actually a feature, not a bug, because it kept sailors' minds occupied with practical concerns, rather than dwelling on the dangers they would soon face. As the final preparations were completed, the ship would settle into an eerie calm before the storm hit. Every crew member knew his position, every piece of equipment was secured, and every system had been tested and double-checked. The ship was as ready as medieval technology and human ingenuity could make it. Now came the waiting, which was often the most difficult part of all. The storm was coming, and there was nothing left to do but endure it with the methodical, boring competence that had kept sailors alive for generations. The actual arrival of or sudden lightning, but by the most not by dramatic thunder, medieval storm was announced mundane of changes. The ship's bell would begin to ring differently, its tone altered by the changing air pressure. Experienced sailors could hear this shift hours before landlubbers would notice anything unusual about the weather. The bell's sound would become slightly flatter, slightly more muffled, as if the air was getting itself thicker. The first visual signs were remarkable. The horizon, equally unray, would begin to blur, not dramatically, but so gradually that you had to stare at it for several minutes to notice the change. Clouds didn't suddenly appear like storm clouds in paintings. Instead, the existing clouds would slowly begin to thicken and lower, a process so gradual it was like watching paint dry, except paint drying was considerably more exciting than watching medieval weather develop. The wind changes that preceded storms were measured not in sudden gusts, but in subtle shifts that required trained attention to detect. The ship's weather vane, usually a simple piece of cloth tied to the rigging, would begin to flutter differently. Not wildly, not dramatically, just differently. Experienced sailors would watch that piece of cloth with the intensity of modern meteorologists watching radar, because those tiny changes in flutter patterns could predict weather conditions hours in advance. The sea itself provided the most reliable storm warnings, but reading these signs required knowledge that took years to develop. The wave patterns would begin to change in ways that were almost imperceptible to untrained eyes. Waves that had been coming from one direction would begin to show cross patterns from another direction, creating a subtle checkerboard effect on the water's surface that indicated conflicting wind systems. The colour of the water would shift gradually from one shade of grey to another. Not blue to black, as dramatic accounts might suggest, but from one type of grey to a slightly different type of grey. Medieval sailors had dozens of different names for watercolours, each one indicating specific weather conditions. They could predict storm intensity based on whether the water was pewter grey, slate grey, or iron grey, distinctions that would be completely lost on modern observers. Seabirds provided their own weather forecasting service, but interpreting their behaviour required understanding bird psychology on the mystical. Gould at Bordeaux would begin flying in slightly different patterns, not fleeing dramatically, but adjusting their flight paths in ways that indicated changing air currents. The birds weren't panicking, they were simply adapting to atmospheric conditions that humans couldn't detect without instruments. When storms finally arrived, they didn't announce themselves with Hollywood dramatics. Instead, they began with a gradual increase in the ship's motion that could barely be detected at first. The deck would begin to tilt just a few degrees more than usual. The creaking of the ship's timbers would become slightly more frequent, slightly more pronounced. These changes were so subtle that inexperienced sailors often didn't notice them until the storm was well underway. The first official storm response was the reduction of sail, a process that was methodical to the point of tedium. Sails weren't dramatically furled in response to howling winds. Instead, they were systematically reduced according to procedures that had been established through centuries of trial and error. The process began with the smallest sails and worked up to the largest, each reduction carefully timed to maintain the ship's stability and control. Reducing sail area involved teams of sailors working in perfect coordination, not because they were particularly well trained, but because the alternative was usually death. Each sail had to be partially lowered, secured, and then lowered further in stages. The process could take hours to complete properly, with crew members making tiny adjustments to rope tension and sail position throughout the entire procedure. The storm sailing configuration that medieval ships adopted was designed for survival, not speed or comfort. The remaining sails were set at specific angles that had been calculated through generations of experience. These angles weren't chosen for efficiency. They were chosen because ships that used different angles had historically ended up at the bottom of the sea. The ships steering that were part during storms required technique seamanship, part mathematics, and part prayer. The helmsman didn't fight the ship's natural motion, but worked with it, making tiny adjustments that kept the vessel positioned properly relative to the waves. The steering technique required feeling the ship's movement through the wheel or tiller, interpreting vibrations and pressures that indicated how the vessel was responding to each wave. Medieval ships rode out storms using a technique called heaving to, which the ship at involved positioning a specific angle to the waves and wind that allowed it to drift while safely. The technique looks maintaining stability, but simple required precise sail and rudder adjustments that had to be maintained throughout the entire storm. Getting angle wrong by even a few degrees could result in the ship being rolled over by large waves. The crew's storm duties were assigned according to a hierarchy that prioritized experience and skill over rank or social status. The most experienced sailors were assigned to the most critical tasks, regardless of their official position in the ship's organization. During storms, a skilled ordinary seaman might out Officer I. Franker Jr. His experience was more relevant to the situation at hand. Communication through a system during storms was accomplished of hand signals and belled crew members to coordinate codes that allow their actions despite noise, wind that made normal speech impossible. The signal system was devised that sailors from so standard different ships could work together effectively, even if they spoke different languages. The signals weren't complex or elegant. They were simply functional and absolutely essential for survival. The ship's pumping system during storms required constant attention, from rotating of crew's sailors who worked in shifts measured by exhaustion rather than time. The bilge pumps had to be operated continuously because storms always caused increased leakage. Amounts of water in, and even small the bilge could affect the ship's stability. Pump crews worked until they physically couldn't continue, then were replaced by the next team. Food during storms consisted entirely that could be eaten without of items didn't require elaborate cooking, aimed with dried meat and preparation. Hardtack was supplement cheese, but even eating these simple foods was challenging when the ship was pitching and rolling violently. And efficiently, because holding sailors learned to eat quickly food during rough weather was nearly impossible. Water consumption during storms was carefully rationed, not because supplies were necessarily limited, but because accessing water barrels during rough weather was dangerous and difficult. Each crew member received ration that a specific daily was calculated to maintain health while conserving supplies. The rationing system was enforced strictly because sharing water fairly during storms prevented conflicts that could endanger the entire crew. Sleep during storms was accomplished in shifts using techniques that maximized rest despite the ship's violent motion. Sailors learned to wedge themselves into their hammocks using pillows and blankets arranged in specific patterns that prevented them from being thrown out during particularly violent movements. The sleeping positions weren't comfortable, but they were functional and allowed for the rest that was essential during extended storm periods. The ship's livestock during storms required attention that was both tedious and critical. Animals had to be checked regularly to ensure they weren't being injured by the ship's motion, but approaching frightened animals in a vile environment, ently moving, was extremely dangerous. Crew members assigned to animal care developed techniques for calming and feeding livestock that took into account both animal psychology and maritime safety. Chickens during storms were particularly problematic because they would often panic and injure themselves trying to escape from their coops. The coops had to be designed with smooth surfaces and rounded corners to prevent injury, and the chickens had, with a secure-to-be provide perches that moved with the ship rather against its than fighting motion. Pigs were more adaptable to storm conditions, but required different management techniques. Pig pens had to drain properly to prevent the animals from standing in water mixed with waste, conditions that could lead to disease problems that would persist long after the storm ended. The pens also had to be designed to contain animals that might become aggressive due to fear and discomfort. The ship's cats during storms were actually useful for maintaining crew morale, not just controlling rats. Cats adapted well to ship motion, and their calm behaviour helped reassure nervous sailors that the situation was manageable. Experienced cats would position themselves in the most stable parts of the ship, providing crew members with visual cues about which areas were safest during rough weather. Navigation during storms was reduced to the most basic dead reckoning techniques, with course and speed estimates that were educated guesses at best. The ship's compass was protected in a specially designed housing that kept it stable despite the violent motion. Taking but accurate compass readings during storms required techniques that bordered on acrobatic. Navigators had to brace themselves securely while trying to read instruments that were constantly moving. Time measurement during storms continued using sand glasses, but there was compromaccuracyized by the difficulty of turning the glasses at precise intervals. Crew members assigned to timekeeping duties had to develop techniques for estimating elapsed time when it was impossible to watch the sand glasses continuously. The time estimates were approximate at best, but they were better than nothing for navigation. The ship's anchor calculation system during storms served as the ultimate safety measure, but deploying anchors in rough weather was extremely dangerous. The anchor had to be lowered carefully to prevent the cable from fouling, and the crew had to coordinate their movements precisely to avoid being injured by heavy anchor equipment moving unpredictably in rough seas. Multiple anchor deployment during severe storms required mathematical calculations that had to be performed under extremely difficult conditions. The angles between anchors had to be calculated to provide maximum holding power while preventing the cables from tangling. Getting the calculations wrong could result in anchor failure at the most critical moment. The psychological management of crew during storms was handled through maintaining normal routines as much as possible. Experienced officers knew that keeping sailors busy with familiar tasks helped prevent panic, even when those tasks seemed pointless given the circumstances. The appearance of normal activity provided psychological anchoring that was as important as the physical anchors holding the ship in place. Crew rotation during extended storms followed patterns that ensured no sailor became so exhausted that he endangered himself or others. The rotation schedules took into account not just physical fatigue, but also the psychological stress of storm duty. Fresh crew members were rotated into critical positions regularly, not because the previous crew was incompetent, but because exhausted sailors made dangerous mistakes. The ship's maintenance during storms was limited to emergency repairs that couldn't be postponed until calmer weather. Broken rigging had to be replaced immediately, and hull damage had to be patched quickly to prevent water intrusion. The repairs were temporary fixes designed to keep the ship functional until proper repairs could be made, but they had to be executed perfectly despite extremely difficult working conditions. Emergency hull repairs during storms often required crew members to work in the most dangerous parts of the ship while it was being pounded by waves. The repair techniques were designed for speed rather than permanence, using materials that could be applied quickly in wet conditions. Oakum and tar could be hammered into gaps even when the wood was soaking wet, providing temporary sealing that might last until... The storm passed. Jong repairs during storms were accomplished using pre-prepared replacement sections that could be installed quickly without extensive rope splicing. The replacement rigging was kept in easily accessible storage areas and was marked clearly so it could be identified even in poor visibility conditions. Speed was critical because damaged rigging could cascade into multiple failures if rep notared immediately. The ship's steering system during storms required constant attention because the rudder and steering cables were subjected to enormous stresses. The steering mechanism had to be checked regularly for signs of failure, and backup steering systems had to be kept ready for immediate deployment. Losing steering control during a storm was often fatal, so redundant systems were essential. Damage. Storm assessment was conducted continuously throughout the storm period, with crew members assigned specifically to monitoring the ship's condition. The assessment followed systematic procedures that ensured no critical problems were overlooked despite the difficult conditions. Damage reports were communicated to officers using the same signal systems used for other storm communications. The ship's bilge system during storms required not just continuous pumping, but also monitoring for changes in water colour or debris damage. The bilge water that might indicate hull was examined regularly for wood shavings or other materials that might indicate structural problems developing below problems, the waterline. Early detection of hull was critical because repairs became much more difficult as damage progressed. Freshwater management during storms included not just rationing, but also protection of the water supply from contamination by seawater or bilge water. The water barrels had to be checked regularly to ensure barrels were intact and that no contamination was occurring. Losing the fresh water supply during a storm was a death sentence, even if the ship survived the weather. Food storage during storms had to account for the possibility that the storm might last much longer than predicted. Emergency food supplies were kept in multiple locations throughout the ship to ensure that food would remain accessible even if parts of the ship became inaccessible due to damage or dangerous conditions. The emergency supplies were calculated to sustain the crew for extended periods without resupply. The ship's heating system during storms was limited to carefully controlled fires that provided warmth without creating fire hazards. Fire was one of the greatest dangers aboard wooden ships, but hypothermia was also a serious threat during extended storms. The balance between warmth and safety required constant attention and judgment calls that could affect the entire crew's survival. Waste management during storms became a significant practical problem because normal waste disposal procedures couldn't be followed safely. Waste had to be stored temporarily in designated areas until conditions improved enough to dispose of it properly overboard. The temporary storage had to prevent contamination of living areas while accounting for the ship's violent motion. Personal hygiene during storms was reduced to the absolute minimum necessary to prevent disease, but even basic hygiene required techniques adapted to the ship's motion and the crew's limited access to water. Sailors developed methods for washing and grooming that used minimal water and could be accomplished quickly in unstable conditions. The ship's tools and equipment during storms had to remain accessible for emergency use, while being secured well enough that they wouldn't become dangerous projectiles. Tool storage systems were designed with mechanisms multiple, securing that could be operated even by exhausted crew members, wearing thick gloves in poor visibility conditions. Clothing management during storms required techniques for keeping essential clothing dry, while allowing for quick changes when crew members became soaked by spray or sweat. Dry clothing was kept in waterproof containers that could be accessed quickly, and wet clothing was managed to prevent it from creating slipping safety hazards or other problems. The ship's lighting during storms was provided by lanterns that had to be secured carefully to prevent fire while providing adequate illumination for essential tasks. The lanterns used special oil that burned cleanly and were equipped with protective glass that could withstand the ship's motion. Lighting management critical was because most storm duties had to be performed in darkness or poor visibility. Care during storms was limited to treating medical injuries that couldn't wait until calmer conditions. But even basic medical procedures were extremely difficult to perform on a violently moving ship. Medical supplies had to be secured in easily accessible locations, and treatment techniques had to be adapted to account for the ship's motion and the limited space available for patient care. The ship's communication with other vessels during storms was accomplished using flag signals and lantern codes that could be seen despite poor visibility and rough seas. The communication systems were designed for simplicity and reliability rather than complexity, because elaborate signals were impossible to execute or interpret under storm conditions. Record keeping during storms was maintained using simplified systems that captured essential information without requiring extensive writing under difficult conditions. Navigation logs, damage reports, and crew status were recorded using abbreviated notation systems quickly, despite the ship's motion that could be update and poor lighting conditions. The storm's end was as gradual and unremarkable as its beginning, marked not by sudden calm but by subtle changes in the ship's motion and the wind's sound. The waves would begin to subside gradually, the ship's creaking would become less frequent, and the crew would slowly begin to realise that they had survived another encounter with the sea's indifferent fury. The post-storm cleanup would begin immediately, another series of tedious methodical tasks that would restore the ship to normal operating condition and prepare it for the next inevitable storm. But before that cleanup could even begin, there was the immediate post-storm assessment, a process so methodical it made the pre-storm preparations look spontaneous. Every crew member had a specific role in determining exactly what had survived the ordeal and what needed immediate attention. This wasn't a casual walk around the deck to see how things looked. This was a systematic inspection that followed procedures developed through centuries of ships that had survived storms, and more importantly, ships that hadn't. The first priority was determining whether the ship was still structurally sound. This meant sending crew members into the deepest, darkest, most unpleasant parts of the vessel to examine every plank, every joint, every piece of the hull that had just spent hours being pounded by forces that could crush a man like an insect. The inspection started at the very bottom of the ship and worked upward, because there was no point in checking the deck if the hull had a hole the size of a dinner plate, letting the ocean in. The bilge inspection after a storm was particularly thorough and particularly unpleasant. The bilge water that had accumulated during the storm wasn't just seawater. It was a cocktail of everything that had been washed, spilled or leaked during the ordeal. Crew members had to wade through this mixture while carrying lanterns, examining every surface for signs of new damage. They weren't looking for obvious holes because obvious holes would have sunk the ship already. They were looking for hairline cracks, loose planking, or areas where the oakum had been worked loose by the storm's pounding. Finding damage in the bilge was like conducting a medical examination on a patient who couldn't tell you where it hurt. The crew members had to feel their way along every surface, running their hands over wood that was slick with bilge water, and various substances they preferred not to identify. They were looking for changes in texture, temperature, or moisture that might indicate structural problems developing where they couldn't be seen. The hull inspection extended below the waterline, which required techniques that were both dangerous and tedious. Some crew members had to go over the side of the ship on ropes, examining the underwater portions of the hull while the vessel was still moving through post-storm seas. This wasn't the dramatic diving you might imagine. It was a careful, systematic process of feeling along the ship's bottom for damage that couldn't be detected from inside. The underwater inspection was conducted using techniques that hadn't changed in generations. A sailor would be lowered on a rope while holding his breath, running his hands along a small section of the hull, then being pulled back up to report what he'd found. The process had to be repeated dozens of times to examine the entire underwater surface, with each inspection lasting only as long as a man could hold his breath while fighting the ship's motion. Above the waterline, the hull inspection was equally thorough, but slightly less life-threatening. Every seam between planks had to be examined for signs that the storm's pounding had worked the caulking loose. The inspection wasn't visual because the naked eye couldn't detect the subtle changes that indicated developing problems. Instead, crew members used their fingers to probe every joint, feeling for movement or softness that suggested the seal was compromised. The deck inspection that followed the hull examination was a study in medieval thoroughness. Every plank of decking had to be checked for cracks, loose nails, or areas where the wood had been weakened by the storm's stresses. The inspection followed a grid pattern that ensured no area was missed, with each crew member responsible for examining a specific section according to procedures that left nothing to chance. Deck damage wasn't always obvious. A plank that looked perfectly sound might have developed stress fractures that would fail under normal walking, creating dangers that wouldn't become apparent until someone stepped through a weakened board and fell into the hold below. The inspection technique involved not just looking at each plank, but testing it by walking on it in a specific pattern that would reveal hidden weaknesses. The rigging inspection after a storm was perhaps the most critical and most time-consuming part of the post-storm assessment. Every rope, every block, every piece of hardware had to be examined for signs of damage that might not be immediately visible. The inspection started at the bottom of the rigging and worked systematically upward, because damaged rigging higher up could fall and injure crew members working below. Each piece of rigging was examined not just visually, but by feel, with experienced sailors running their hands along every rope to detect fraying, stretching, or other damage that might not be visible in the poor light conditions that often followed storms. The inspection technique required knowledge of how each piece of rigging should feel when it was in good condition. Knowledge that came only from years of experience handling ropes under every possible condition. Rigging damage discovered during post-storm inspections fell into categories that determined repair priorities. Complete failures had to be replaced immediately because they affected the ship's ability to sail safely. Partial damage could sometimes be repaired temporarily until proper replacement materials were available. Minor damage was noted for future repair, but didn't require immediate attention. The sail inspection that followed the rigging examination was conducted with the same methodical thoroughness. Every sail had to be completely unfurled and examined inch by inch for tears, weak spots, or areas where the fabric had been stressed beyond its normal limits. The examination wasn't just about finding obvious damage, it was about detecting subtle changes in the fabric that might indicate developing problems. Sail damage from storms often appeared in patterns that experienced sailors could read like a book. Certain types of tears indicated specific problems with rigging tension. Other damage patterns suggested that the sail had been subjected to wind forces from unusual directions. Understanding these patterns helped crew members not just repair the immediate damage, but also identify underlying problems that might cause future failures. The process of examining sails after a storm required spreading each sail out on deck in an organised pattern that allowed every section to be inspected systematically. This wasn't just a matter of unfolding the sails and looking at them. Each sail had to be arranged so that light could pass through the fabric, revealing thin spots or areas where the weave had been damaged in ways that weren't visible from one side alone. Sail repairs discovered during post-storm inspections were prioritised according to their effect on the ship's sailing ability. Sails that were completely unusable had to be replaced or extensively repaired before the ship could sail safely. Sails with minor damage could often be used temporarily, while repairs were being made during calmer periods. The ship's steering system received its own comprehensive post-storm inspection, because steering failure had killed more sailors than dramatic shipwrecks. The inspection started with the rudder itself, examining the massive wooden blade that controlled the ship's direction for signs of damage that might not be apparent from the ship's handling. Rudder damage could be subtle, affecting the ship's steering in ways that only became apparent during manoeuvres. The rudder inspection required sending crew members into the water to examine the underwater portions of the steering system, another job that combined danger with tedium. The examination had to determine whether the rudder was still properly attached to the ship, whether it had been damaged by debris during the storm, and whether the mechanical connections between the rudder and the ship's steering wheel were still functioning properly. Above the waterline, the steering system inspection focused on the mechanical components that translated the helmsman's actions into rudder movement. Every pulley, every rope, every mechanical connection had to be examined for signs of damage or excessive wear that might cause steering failure at a critical moment. The inspection techniques required understanding not just how the steering system looked when it was working properly, but how it felt and sounded during normal operation. The ship's anchor system underwent its own post-storm examination because anchors that had held the ship steady during the storm might have been damaged by the enormous stresses they had endured. The anchor inspection started with examining the anchor cable for signs that it had been stretched, kinked or abraded during the storm. Anchor cables that looked perfectly sound might have been weakened in ways that would cause them to fail during the next emergency. The anchors themselves had to be raised and examined for damage that might affect their holding power. This wasn't just a matter of looking for obvious breaks or bends. Anchors could be damaged in subtle ways that reduced their effectiveness without making them completely unusable. The inspection techniques required understanding how anchors were supposed to look and how various types of damage affected their performance. The anchor windlass, the mechanical system used to raise and lower the anchors, received particular attention during post-storm inspections. The windlass had been subjected to enormous stresses during the storm, and mechanical failures in the anchor system could leave the ship helpless in the next emergency. Every gear, every rope, every mechanical component had to be examined and tested to ensure it would function when needed. The ship's water supply was tested and evaluated after every storm because contamination of the fresh water supply was a death sentence that might not become apparent for days or weeks. The testing wasn't sophisticated by modern standards, but it was thorough according to medieval techniques. Each water barrel was opened and the water was examined for colour, smell and taste that might indicate contamination by seawater or other substances. Water barrels that showed any sign of contamination had to be emptied completely and cleaned before being refilled with fresh water. The cleaning process was time-consuming and used precious freshwater reserves, but it was essential because contaminated water could sicken or kill the entire crew. The cleaning techniques involved multiple rinses with vinegar or wine, substances that medieval sailors believed could neutralize contamination. The ship's food supplies received their own post-storm inspection, because food spoilage during storms could create health problems that would persist long after the weather cleared. Every barrel of preserved meat, every container of hardtack, every stored item had to be examined for signs of moisture, intrusion, or contamination that might cause it to spoil before the voyage was completed. Food contamination during storms often occurred when seawater leaked into storage areas, or when the ship's motion caused containers to break open and mix different types of provisions. The inspection techniques required not just examining the food itself, but also checking the storage containers for damage that might allow future contamination. Food that showed any sign of spoilage had to be discarded immediately, regardless of how much of the ship's provisions it represented. The livestock inspection after storms was both practical and emotional, because animals that had survived the storm might still die from injuries or stress that weren't immediately apparent. Each animal had to be examined for injuries that might have occurred when they were thrown against their enclosures during rough weather. The examination techniques required understanding animal behaviour well enough to detect injuries that the animals might be hiding due to fear or stress. Animals that had been injured during storms required immediate treatment using techniques that combined veterinary knowledge with maritime practicality. Injured animals couldn't receive the same level of care they might get on land, but they needed enough treatment to keep them alive until the ship reached port. The treatment techniques were designed to be effective using materials and methods available aboard ship. The ship's cats received particular attention during post-storm inspections, not just because they were valued for rat control, but because their behaviour often indicated problems that humans couldn't detect. Cats that seemed unusually agitated or refused to enter certain parts of the ship might be responding to sounds, smells, or other signs of damage that human senses couldn't perceive. Experienced sailors learned to interpret cat behaviour as part of their damage assessment procedures. The psychological condition of the crew after storms was assessed through informal observation rather than formal procedures, but it was no less important than the mechanical inspections. Sailors who had been traumatised by the storm might make dangerous mistakes during the recovery period, and crew members who were too exhausted to function safely had to be identified and given time to recover before being assigned to critical tasks. Crew morale after storms was managed through maintaining normal routines as much as possible while acknowledging that the crew had survived a dangerous ordeal. Officers who ignored the psychological impact of storms often found their crews becoming increasingly unreliable during subsequent emergencies. The management techniques involved balancing the need to return to normal operations with recognition that the crew needed time to process their recent experience. The ship's tools and equipment underwent systematic inspection after storms, because tools that had been damaged during rough weather could cause injuries or failures during normal operations. Every tool had to be examined not just for obvious damage, but for subtle problems like loose handles, dulled edges, or bent components that might cause them to fail when they were needed most. Tool replacement after storms often required improvisation using materials available aboard ship, because medieval vessels didn't carry extensive spare inventories of specialised equipment. Crew members had to be able to repair or replace essential tools using whatever materials were available, techniques that required both mechanical skill and creative problem-solving ability. The ship's compass and navigation equipment received careful attention during post-storm inspections, because navigation errors caused by damaged instruments could be more dangerous than the storm itself. The compass had to be tested to ensure it was still properly magnetised and that the housing hadn't been damaged in ways that affected its accuracy. Testing compass accuracy required techniques that could be performed aboard ship using celestial references or known landmarks. Navigation instruments that had been damaged during storms had to be repaired or replaced using techniques that medieval navigators had developed through necessity. Compass needles could be remagnetized using lodestone. Compass housings could be repaired using materials available aboard ship, and backup navigation methods could be employed until proper instruments were available. The ship's lighting system was restored after storms using techniques that balanced the need for adequate illumination with fire safety concerns. Lanterns that had been extinguished during the storm had to be relit carefully to prevent fires, and the oil and wick systems had to be checked to ensure they hadn't been damaged by moisture or rough handling during the storm. Fire safety after storms was particularly critical because the ship's wood might be saturated with moisture that made it more vulnerable to fire damage, while the crew's fatigue might make them careless with open flames. Fire prevention techniques after storms included extra vigilance around all sources of ignition and systematic checks of areas where fires might start undetected. The process of returning the ship to normal operations after a storm was as methodical as the storm preparation had been, with each system being restored according to procedures that ensured nothing was overlooked. The restoration process could take days to complete properly, with crew members working systematically through checklists that existed in their collective memory rather than written form. The final step in post-storm recovery was preparing for the next storm, because medieval sailors understood that surviving one storm was just preparation for surviving the next one. Lessons learned during the recent storm were incorporated into the ship's procedures, damaged equipment was repaired or replaced, and the crew's knowledge was updated based on their recent experience. The cycle of preparation, survival, and recovery continued throughout every voyage, a endless routine of boring competence that kept medieval sailors alive in one of the world's most dangerous occupations. And as the ship settled back into its normal routine, with every rope checked, every sail mended, and every barrel secured, the crew would begin once again the daily tasks that prepared them for the next inevitable encounter with the sea's indifferent power. The storm was over, but the ocean remained, patient and eternal, waiting for the next opportunity to test human ingenuity against natural forces that had been sinking ships since humans first dared to venture beyond sight of land. The recovery period after a major storm wasn't a celebration. It was the beginning of the most tedious phase of medieval seamanship, a process so methodical and mind-numbingly thorough that it made watching grass grow seem like an action-packed adventure. Every single item aboard the ship had to be accounted for, inspected, dried, reorganised, and prepared for the next inevitable encounter with bad weather. This wasn't spring cleaning. This was survival maintenance disguised as the most boring activity known to medieval mankind. The drying process alone could take weeks, depending on the weather that followed the storm. Everything aboard the ship had been soaked, not just with seawater, but with a mixture of seawater, rain, bilge water, and various other liquids that no one wanted to identify too closely. Clothes, bedding, rope, sails, food containers, personal belongings, everything had to be systematically dried using techniques that required constant attention and endless patience. Rope drying was particularly critical because wet rope was weak rope, and weak rope killed sailors. Each piece of rigging had to be completely dried before it could be considered safe for use. This meant uncoiling every rope aboard the ship, hanging it in specific patterns that allowed air to circulate around every strand, and monitoring the drying process to ensure that no section remained damp long enough to develop rot. The rope drying process followed procedures that had been refined through generations of trial and error. Thick cables had to be untwisted partially to allow air to reach the interior fibres, then rewoven once they were completely dry. The process required teams of sailors working in coordination because improperly dried rope would fail at the worst possible moment, usually during the next storm when lives depended on every piece of rigging holding under stress. Sail drying was even more complex because sails were much larger than ropes and couldn't simply be hung over the side of the ship. Sails had to be spread out on deck in patterns that allowed both sides of the fabric to dry evenly while preventing the weight of wet fabric from stretching the material beyond its normal dimensions. The process required the entire deck to be cleared of other activities while each sail was systematically dried and inspected. The sail drying rotation had to account for changing wind directions because sails that dried unevenly would develop stress points that could tear during normal use. Crew members had to constantly adjust the position of drying sails to ensure that air circulated evenly across all sections of the fabric. The process was like choreographing a very slow, very boring dance performed by exhausted sailors on a deck that was still damp from the recent storm. Clothing and bedding drying presented its own set of challenges because personal items had to be dried without interfering with the more critical ship maintenance activities. Sailors had developed techniques for drying their belongings using the ship's rigging as clotheslines, but the techniques required careful coordination to ensure that personal items didn't interfere with sail handling or other essential activities. The bedding drying process was particularly unpleasant because medieval bedding wasn't just wet, it was wet with a mixture of substances that had been sloshing around in the ship's interior during the storm. Straw mattresses had to be completely emptied, the straw spread out to dry, and the mattress covers cleaned and dried separately. The process could take days, during which sailors slept on bare planks or whatever dry material they could improvise. Food storage restoration after storms required techniques that combined food preservation with moisture management. Every container of food had to be opened, inspected for contamination, and either dried or discarded depending on its condition. The inspection process required knowledge of food spoilage that came only through experience, because contaminated food could kill the entire crew, even if the ship had successfully weathered the storm. Hardtack that had gotten wet during storms presented particular challenges, because wet hardtack was not only inedible, it was a breeding ground for mould and insects that could contaminate other food supplies. Wet hardtack had to be completely dried using carefully controlled heat sources that wouldn't burn the food while removing all moisture. The drying process took days and required constant attention to prevent the hardtack from burning or developing mould during the drying process. Preserved meat that had been exposed to moisture during storms had to be examined piece by piece for signs of spoilage that might not be immediately apparent. The examination techniques required understanding the difference between normal preservation changes and actual spoilage, knowledge that came only through years of experience handling preserved foods under maritime conditions. Cheese and other dairy products that had survived the storm required special handling because they were particularly susceptible to spoilage from moisture exposure. The preservation techniques used for dairy products during post-storm recovery involved careful cleaning, drying and recoating with protective substances that would prevent further spoilage during the remainder of the voyage. Water barrel maintenance after storms was critical because the fresh water supply was literally a matter of life and death. Every water barrel had to be inspected for leaks, contamination, and structural damage that might cause problems later in the voyage. The inspection process involved not just looking at the barrels but testing them by filling them completely and monitoring for leakage over extended periods. Water barrels that showed any sign of contamination had to be emptied, cleaned with vinegar or wine, and refilled with fresh water if any was available. The cleaning process was expensive because it used precious supplies of wine or vinegar, but it was essential because contaminated water could kill the crew more quickly than starvation. The barrel maintenance process extended beyond just the water containers to include all the ship's storage barrels, each of which had to be inspected for damage that might have occurred during the storm. Barrel hoops had to be retightened, wood had to be checked for cracks or splitting, and the contents of each barrel had to be verified to ensure that nothing had been lost or contaminated during the rough weather. Tool maintenance after storms required systematic inspection and care of every piece of equipment aboard the ship. Tools that had been exposed to seawater during the storm had to be cleaned, dried, and treated with oil or grease to prevent rust that could make them useless. The maintenance process followed specific procedures for each type of tool because different materials required different preservation techniques. Iron tools required immediate attention after exposure to seawater because rust could make them dangerous as well as useless. Each iron tool had to be cleaned completely, dried thoroughly, and coated with oil or animal fat that would protect it from further corrosion. The protection process had to be repeated regularly throughout the voyage because the maritime environment was constantly attacking iron tools with moisture and salt. Wooden tools and handles required different maintenance techniques because wood that had been soaked in seawater could split, warp, or rot if not properly dried and treated. Wooden handles had to be dried slowly to prevent cracking, then treated with oil or tar that would protect them from moisture while maintaining their strength and flexibility. The ship's weapons underwent their own maintenance routine after storms because weapons that failed during pirate attacks or other emergencies could cost the crew their lives. Swords, crossbows, and other weapons had to be completely disassembled, cleaned, dried, and reassembled using techniques that ensured they would function properly when needed. Crossbow maintenance was particularly complex because crossbows contained multiple materials that each required different care. The wooden stock had to be dried and treated to prevent warping. The metal components had to be cleaned and oiled to prevent rust, and the bowstring had to be replaced if it had been damaged by moisture during the storm. Sword maintenance involved not just cleaning and oiling the blade, but also checking the handle wrapping and the balance of the weapon. Swords that had been damaged during storms might not be obviously broken but could fail during combat if their balance had been affected by moisture damage to the handle or tang. The ship's cooking equipment required extensive maintenance after storms because cooking fires were essential for crew health and morale. The firebox had to be cleaned of sand and debris that had been added during storm preparation, and all cooking implements had to be cleaned, dried, and organised for normal use. Cooking pot maintenance involved checking for cracks or damage that might have occurred when the pots were thrown around during rough weather. Cracked pots weren't just inconvenient, they were dangerous because they could spill hot food or water on crew members during meal preparation. Each pot had to be tested by filling it with water and checking for leaks before it could be returned to service. The galley organisation after storms required repositioning all cooking equipment according to normal operating procedures, while accounting for any damage that might have occurred during the storm. The organisation process followed specific patterns that ensured cooking could be accomplished safely and efficiently, even in rough seas that might occur before the next storm. Personal belongings. Restoration was handled by individual crew members according to techniques they had learned through experience. Each sailor was responsible for drying, cleaning, and maintaining his own possessions using whatever methods and materials were available. The techniques varied depending on the materials involved, but they all shared the common goal of preserving items that might be impossible to replace during the voyage. Clothing maintenance after storms involved techniques for removing salt deposits that had been left by dried seawater, because salt-crusted clothing was uncomfortable and could cause skin problems during long voyages. The cleaning techniques used seawater or urine, because fresh water was too precious to waste on laundry, but the cleaning had to be followed by thorough rinsing and drying to remove the cleaning agents. Personal tool maintenance was each sailor's responsibility, but it followed the same basic principles as ship's tool maintenance. Each crew member had to ensure that his personal knife, sewing kit, and other essential items were cleaned, dried, and maintained in working condition. Personal tools that failed could endanger not just the individual sailor, but the entire crew, if the tools were needed for emergency repairs. The ship's rats received attention during post-storm recovery, not because anyone particularly cared about rat welfare, but because dead rats created health hazards, and live rats provided early warning systems for future problems. Dead rats had to be found and removed before they began to decompose and create disease problems, while live rats had to be monitored to ensure the ship's ecosystem remained in balance. Rat population management after storms involved assessing whether the rat population had been affected by the storm and taking appropriate action to maintain the balance between having enough rats to serve as an early warning system and having so many rats that they became a serious problem. Too few rats meant losing the early warning system, while too many rats meant they would consume food supplies and create sanitation problems. The ship's cats were monitored during post-storm recovery to ensure they hadn't been injured or traumatized by the storm experience. Cats that had been injured needed treatment using whatever medical supplies were available, while cats that had been psychologically affected by the storm needed time and gentle handling to return to normal behaviour patterns. Cat behaviour monitoring continued throughout the recovery period because cats often detected problems that humans couldn't perceive. Cats that avoided certain areas of the ship or seemed unusually agitated might be responding to smells, sounds, or other signs of damage that required investigation. experienced sailors learned to interpret cat behaviour as part of their ongoing damage assessment procedures. The ship's structural assessment continued throughout the recovery period, with crew members conducting daily inspections that went beyond the immediate post-storm damage evaluation. The ongoing assessment was designed to detect problems that might develop gradually as the ship's structure adjusted to any damage that had occurred during the storm. Timber inspection during the recovery period involved checking for signs that the ship's wooden structure was beginning to work loose, or develop stress fractures that weren't apparent immediately after the storm. The inspection techniques required understanding how wood behaved under stress and recognizing the early signs of structural problems that could become dangerous if left untreated. The caulking inspection continued throughout the recovery period because caulking that had survived the initial storm impact might begin to fail gradually as the ship's structure settled back into normal patterns. Caulking failure was often gradual rather than sudden, so continuous monitoring was necessary to detect problems before they became serious leaks. Hull flexing assessment involved monitoring how the ship's hull responded to normal wave action after the storm, because hull damage might not become apparent until the ship encountered different types of sea conditions. The assessment techniques required experienced crew members who could detect subtle changes in the ship's behaviour that might indicate structural problems developing gradually. The rigging assessment continued throughout the recovery period with daily inspections that checked not just for obvious damage, but for subtle changes in rope behaviour that might indicate developing problems. Rigging that had been stressed during the storm might begin to stretch or fray gradually, creating dangers that wouldn't be apparent unless the rigging was monitored continuously. Sail shape monitoring involved checking whether sails that had been stressed during the storm were holding their proper shape during normal sailing conditions. Sails that had been damaged might not tear immediately, but could develop distortions that affected the ship's sailing performance and created stress points that could fail during the next storm. The anchor system continued to receive attention throughout the recovery period because anchor equipment that had been stressed during the storm might develop problems gradually rather than failing immediately. Anchor cable inspection involved checking for signs of stretching, kinking, or internal damage that might not be visible from the outside but could cause anchor failure during the next emergency. Navigation equipment maintenance continued throughout the recovery period with daily checks of compass accuracy and other instruments that might have been affected by the storm. Navigation errors caused by damaged instruments could accumulate gradually, leading the ship far off course before the problems became apparent to the crew. Water supply monitoring continued throughout the recovery period because contamination problems might not become apparent immediately after the storm. Water quality had to be checked regularly for changes in taste, smell, or appearance that might indicate developing contamination problems that could threaten the crew's health. Food supply assessment continued throughout the recovery period with regular checks for spoilage that might not have been apparent during the immediate post-storm inspection. Food spoilage could develop gradually, and early detection was critical for preventing the loss of supplies that might be essential for completing the voyage. The recovery period gradually transitioned back into normal shipboard routine, but the transition was as methodical as every other aspect of medieval seamanship. Each system had to be restored to full operational status according to procedures that ensured nothing was overlooked and no shortcuts were taken that might create problems during future emergencies. Normal watch schedules were restored gradually, with crew members transitioning from storm recovery duties back to regular sailing duties according to schedules that accounted for their fatigue and the need to maintain continuous ship operations. The transition had to be managed carefully to ensure that essential maintenance activities continued while normal sailing operations resumed. The ship's daily routine was restored systematically, with each regular activity being resumed according to procedures that ensured it could be performed safely and effectively despite any lingering effects from the storm. The routine restoration process was designed to return the ship to normal operations while maintaining the heightened state of preparedness that was necessary for surviving the next storm. And inevitably, there would be a next storm. Medieval sailors understood that surviving one storm was simply preparation for surviving the next one, and the recovery period was as much about preparing for future storms as it was about dealing with the effects of the recent one. The cycle of preparation, survival, and recovery continued endlessly, a routine so boring and methodical that it could lull anyone to sleep, which was exactly the point of tonight's journey into the magnificently mundane world of medieval maritime survival. The ship settled back into its normal rhythm, creaking gently as it rode the now calm swells, every rope properly tensioned, every sail correctly trimmed, every barrel securely positioned for the next inevitable encounter with the sea's patient, persistent attempts to claim another vessel for the depths. The crew resumed their daily routines of inspection, maintenance and preparation, secure in the knowledge that their boring, methodical competence was the only thing standing between them and a watery grave that had claimed countless ships whose crews had been just a little less thorough, a little less patient, a little less committed to the tedious art of staying alive at sea. The endless routine of medieval maritime life settled into patterns so predictable they could cure the most stubborn case of insomnia. Day after day, watch after watch, the same tasks performed with the same methodical precision that had kept sailors alive since humans first decided that floating on vast expanses of water was a reasonable way to make a living. The morning watch began every single day at exactly the same time, marked by the ship's bell that rang with the consistency of a particularly reliable rooster, except roosters occasionally slept in and ship's bells never did. The first task was always the same, checking the wind direction using techniques that had remained unchanged since the dawn of navigation. A piece of cloth tied to the rigging would flutter in patterns that experienced sailors could read like a book, but it was the most boring book ever written, with chapters titled things like Northeast Wind, Light to Moderate, and Steady from the Southwest, No Change Expected. Wind reading was an art form that required the patience of a monk and the observational skills of a particularly dedicated accountant. Sailors didn't just glance at the wind indicator and move on. They studied it with the intensity of scholars, examining ancient manuscripts, noting not just the direction, but the consistency, the strength variations, and the subtle changes that might indicate weather developments hours in the future. The process could take 20 minutes of standing perfectly still, watching a piece of cloth move in ways that would bore a statue to tears. Temperature assessment followed wind observation, conducted using techniques that made medieval weather forecasting look like cutting-edge science. Sailors would stand motionless on deck, feeling the air temperature against their skin with the concentration of wine tasters evaluating a particularly subtle vintage. They weren't just determining whether it was hot or cold. They were detecting microscopic changes in air temperature that might indicate atmospheric pressure changes that could affect weather patterns days in advance. The temperature evaluation process involved exposing different parts of the body to the air in sequence, because different skin areas responded to temperature changes at different rates. A sailor might stand with his face to the wind for several minutes, then turn sideways, then backward, building a comprehensive understanding of air temperature patterns that would inform decisions about sail configuration and storm preparation for the entire day ahead. Humidity assessment was accomplished through techniques that combined meteorology with what could generously be called medieval science. Sailors would observe how quickly moisture evaporated from wet surfaces, how their clothes felt against their skin, and how their hair behaved in the ambient air. These observations weren't casual glances. They were systematic evaluations that followed procedures passed down through generations of sailors who had learned to predict weather through pure sensory observation. The daily rope inspection that followed weather assessment was a meditation in tedium that would challenge the patience of the most dedicated Buddhist monk. Every single piece of rigging had to be examined, using techniques so thorough they made modern quality control procedures look hasty and superficial. The inspection wasn't conducted quickly or casually. Each rope was examined inch by inch, with sailors running their hands along every strand while looking for signs of wear, stretching, or damage that might not be visible to casual observation. Rope inspection techniques required knowledge that took years to develop and decades to perfect. Experienced sailors could detect problems by touch that wouldn't be visible for weeks. They could feel subtle changes in rope texture that indicated internal damage, identify stress patterns that suggested the rope was approaching failure, and predict which pieces of rigging would need replacement based on wear patterns that were invisible to untrained eyes. The inspection process followed routes through the ship's rigging that ensured every rope was examined systematically, without missing anything or duplicating effort. Sailors would start at specific points and work through the rigging in patterns that had been refined over generations, each pattern designed to provide complete coverage while maintaining efficiency that allowed the inspection to be completed within the time constraints of normal watch schedules. Knot inspection was a subset of rope examination that required its own specialized knowledge and techniques. Every knot aboard the ship had to be checked not just for security, but for proper configuration, appropriate tension, and signs of slippage that might indicate the knot was beginning to fail. Knot inspection wasn't just looking at knots, it was testing them by applying controlled pressure while feeling for movement or looseness that might indicate developing problems. The daily sail examination followed rope inspection and was conducted with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized every aspect of medieval ship maintenance. Sails weren't just checked for obvious tears or damage. They were examined for subtle changes in fabric tension, color variations that might indicate weak spots developing, and stress patterns that could predict where problems might develop in the future. Sail inspection techniques involve both visual examination and physical testing, with sailors running their hands across sail surfaces while looking for thin spots, rough areas, or sections where the fabric felt different from normal. The inspection process required knowledge of how sail fabric should feel under different conditions, understanding that came only through years of handling sails in every possible weather condition. The stitching inspection that was part of sail examination required examining every seam where pieces of sail fabric had been sewn together. Stitching failure was one of the most common causes of sail damage, and detecting stitching problems before they became serious tears required techniques that bordered on the microscopic. Sailors would examine stitching patterns with magnifying glasses made from pieces of clear glass, looking for signs of thread wear or tension changes that might indicate developing problems. Sail attachment point inspection involved checking every location where sails connected to rigging, because attachment failures could cause sails to tear free during storms and become dangerous debris that could injure crew members or damage other parts of the ship. The inspection techniques required understanding the stresses that different attachment points experienced under various sailing conditions and recognizing signs of wear that might indicate approaching failure. The daily deck inspection that followed sail examination was conducted with techniques that made modern building inspections look casual and superficial. Every plank of decking had to be examined for cracks, loose nails, soft spots, or other signs of deterioration that might affect the structural integrity of the ship's primary working surface. The inspection wasn't conducted by walking across the deck and looking around. It required systematic examination of every square inch of decking using procedures that left nothing to chance. Deck inspection techniques involve both visual examination and physical testing, with sailors probing suspicious areas using tools specifically designed for detecting wood problems that weren't visible from the surface. Soft spots in decking could indicate rot developing beneath the surface, while unusual flexibility might suggest that structural supports were failing in ways that wouldn't be apparent until someone stepped through a weakened area. The daily caulking inspection was perhaps the most tedious part of ship maintenance, requiring examination of every seam between deck planks and hull planks for signs that the waterproofing material was beginning to fail. Caulking inspection wasn't conducted quickly or casually. It required systematic probing of every joint using specialised tools while looking for signs of movement, softness, or deterioration that might allow water to penetrate the ship's interior. Caulking maintenance involved not just finding problems, but understanding why problems developed and taking preventive action to stop small problems from becoming major structural failures. The maintenance techniques required knowledge of how different types of wood responded to moisture changes, how caulking materials behaved under various temperature conditions, and how the ship's structural movements affected the integrity of waterproofing systems. The bilge inspection that was conducted daily required crew members to descend into the deepest, dampest, most unpleasant parts of the ship to examine areas where water naturally accumulated and problems typically developed first. Bilge inspection wasn't just checking to see if water was present, it was systematic examination of bilge water for colour changes, debris content, and smell variations that might indicate developing problems in other parts of the ship. Bilge water analysis was conducted using techniques that combined chemistry with experience gained through years of examining bilge water under various conditions. Changes in bilge water characteristics could indicate hull damage, caulking failure, or contamination from other ship systems. Detecting these changes early was critical for preventing small problems from becoming catastrophic failures that could sink the ship. The daily tool inventory that followed structural inspections required accounting for every tool aboard the ship, while checking each tool's condition and readiness for use. Tool inventory wasn't just counting tools, it was systematic examination of each tool for damage, wear, or deterioration that might affect its performance during emergency situations when tool failure could cost lives. Tool maintenance followed inventory and involved cleaning, sharpening, oiling, and repairing tools according to schedules that ensured every tool would function properly when needed. The maintenance procedures were specific to each type of tool and required knowledge of metallurgy, wood care, and preservation techniques that kept tools functional despite the harsh maritime environment that constantly attacked metal with salt and wood with moisture. The daily food inspection required examining all food supplies for signs of spoilage, contamination, or pest infestation that might threaten the crew's health or reduce the food supplies needed to complete the voyage. Food inspection techniques involved not just looking at food, but smelling, touching, and sometimes tasting small samples to detect problems that might not be visible from external examination. Food preservation maintenance involved rotating food supplies according to schedules that ensured older supplies were used before they spoiled while maintaining adequate reserves for emergency situations. The rotation procedures required detailed knowledge of how different types of preserved foods deteriorated under maritime conditions, and how to maximise food supply longevity without compromising crew nutrition or health. Water quality assessment was conducted daily using techniques that evaluated not just the quantity of fresh water remaining, but also its quality and safety for consumption. Water testing involved examining water samples for colour changes, sediment content, smell variations, and taste alterations that might indicate contamination or deterioration that could sicken the crew. Water conservation procedures followed quality assessment and involved managing water consumption to ensure adequate supplies remained available throughout the voyage while maintaining crew health and morale. Water management required balancing conservation with the need to maintain crew hydration and the water requirements for food preparation and basic sanitation. The daily livestock care routine involved feeding, watering, and health assessment of all animals aboard the ship, using techniques that maintained animal health while managing the challenges of keeping livestock healthy in the confined, constantly moving environment of a sailing vessel. Livestock care wasn't just providing food and water, it was comprehensive animal husbandry conducted under conditions that would challenge modern veterinarians. Animal health monitoring involved observing animal behaviour patterns, checking for signs of illness or injury, and providing treatment using whatever medical supplies and techniques were available aboard ship. Animal health problems could affect not just the animals, but also the crew's food supply and morale, so maintaining livestock health was critical for voyage success. The daily navigation routine involved calculating the ship's position, assessing weather conditions, and planning the day's sailing course using techniques that combined mathematics, astronomy, and seamanship experience. Navigation wasn't conducted once per day and forgotten. It was an ongoing process that required constant attention to wind conditions, sea states, and celestial observations that provided the information needed to keep the ship on course. Dead reckoning calculations were updated throughout the day as sailing conditions changed, with navigators constantly adjusting their position estimates based on speed estimates, time measurements, and course changes that affect the ship's location relative to its intended destination. The calculations required mathematical skills combined with practical seamanship knowledge that came only through years of experience navigating under various conditions. The daily watch rotation system ensured that crew members were assigned to duties according to schedules that maintained ship operations while providing adequate rest for all crew members. Watch schedules weren't arbitrary assignments. They were carefully planned rotations that accounted for each crew member's skills, experience level, and physical condition while ensuring that critical ship functions were maintained continuously. And there you have it. Hours upon hours of the most magnificently mundane details that kept medieval sailors breathing when the ocean wanted them dead. From the mind-numbing process of picking apart old rope fibre by fibre, to the soul-crushing tedium of checking every single knot on a ship twice daily. These weren't the heroic adventures that fill our imaginations. They were simply the boring, methodical, utterly essential routines that stood between life and drowning. Sweet dreams, and sleep well, knowing that somewhere in history, someone spent their entire day watching sand fall through a glass just to keep track of time at sea.